Anna, will you put the slides up because and keep them moving, because I don't know how to do that.
Yes, I will start showing it whenever you're ready to speak.
Great. And then do I just say next slide, or how do we?
Yes, yes, that would help.
All right, excellent.
All right, well, we're just waiting on the official go word, and we'll get into it.
Let's Dave, will you hand me host, and I'll go ahead and get the live stream going?
Yes, you got it.
And Curtis, are you still monitoring our live stream or the page there?
Yes, I'm actually trying to get it going now. I'm having a little bit of trouble trying to link it.
We are live on YouTube TV.
Thank you, Mariah.
Great. I'm looking to see myself on TV. I haven't seen myself on TV yet. There we go. All right, we are live today with the Task Force for Community and Policing Relations. And today our topic is going to be restorative justice. I am Commissioner Harold Johnson, Commissioner of the 4th District of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County. Starting out this morning, our mayor will be joining us momentarily. But in the meantime, we want to get introductions from all of the task force members that have joined us today. And so I'll just call your names, and as I call your names, you can just give a quick introduction, then we'll get into our presentation. So I see Reverend Tony Carter is the first face I see up there, so we'll go with you, Reverend Carter.
Thank you, Brother Johnson, and hello to everybody on the task force and all of our guests. I'm Pastor Tony Carter. I pastor the Salem Baptist Church here in Kansas City, Kansas. Also a member of the Law Enforcement Advisory Board, and grateful to be here today.
Great, thank you, Reverend Carter. Dr. Evelyn Hill.
Hello and welcome. My name is Evelyn Hill, and I am the Director of Equity and Justice here at Avenue of Life. Glad to be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Mr. Mendoza. You have to, yeah, there you go.
There we go. Thank you. My name is Max Mendoza. I'm the Executive Director of Heartland 180 Incorporated, a youth service agency here in Kansas City. And I also serve as a governor appointee on the Kansas Advisory Group on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and also as an appointee on the Kansas Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee.
Great. Welcome aboard. We're glad to have you on board with the task force. Sheriff?
Good afternoon. Don Ash, Wyandotte County Sheriff's Office.
Great. Let's see here. Monsignor Swetland.
I'm Monsignor Stuart Swetland. I'm the 7th president of Donley College, and it's good to be with everybody today.
Great. Mr. Curtis Smart.
Hello, I'm Curtis Smart. Glad to be here on the task force. I recently received my MPH from Kansas University Medical Center, and I'm looking forward to today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief York.
Hello, everyone. Interim Chief Mike York. Glad to be here.
Great. We also have Assistant County Administrator Gordon Criswell with us today as well from the Administrator's Office.
Good afternoon, Commissioner Johnson and members of the task force. Welcome to another meeting of this important work, and glad to assist where I can. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 3 presentations today. The first one will be by Monsignor Stuart Swetland from Donnelly College. Following that, we'll have another presentation or PowerPoint from Elder Randy George and Elder Stephen Barbie from the Village Initiative. And then we'll close out with a presentation by Mr. John Stapleton from Stapleton and Associates, Midwest ADR. So we'll start with Monsignor Swetland this morning with the Restorative Justice PowerPoint. Monsignor's in your hands.
Thank you very much. And I think we're going to be sharing the screen for the PowerPoint. And as we do that, I just want to say that it's an honor to present. This is going to be the theoretical. We're going to talk about the practical with other presentations. My presentation is the theoretical understanding of restorative justice. This is a very brief introduction. I first became aware of restorative justice in a group I worked with at my former university, Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. There we wrote a book, Where Justice and Mercy Meets, which was a book on the death penalty. But as a subsequent work, sort of a second volume, if you will, of that work, was Redemption and Restoration, which was a Catholic perspective on restorative justice. I contributed a couple of chapters to the first work on the death penalty, but it was my colleagues who did the second volume. And so I'm reporting a lot to you about their work, which I am very impressed with as someone who teaches in the area of social thought. So this is a very brief justice, the next very brief introduction, and the next slide gets to one of the most ancient questions in philosophy, and that is, what is justice? So next slide, please. Can we have the slide 2? And can you bring up slide 2, or? We're having a little technical trouble. Or are you all seeing slide 2? Commissioner Johnson, are you?
No, we're not seeing slide 2. I think we might be having a few challenges with the PowerPoint. Anna, are you sliding those through, or Dave? Okay, I'm not getting any answer at all on these.
Yeah. So do you want me to try to push on without the slide? That's going to be a little awkward, but.
Yeah, let's see here. I think so. We might have not have a choice.
Monsignor, I see the slides on the left side of the screen.
Yep.
Yeah. But they're not, we don't have control to
right.
move. I don't have control to move those. I think Anna, well, they might be trying to pull it back up here.
Yeah.
But if you'll find that if you pinch that screen when it was up, you pinch that screen, you can make it bigger. But I did that, then I got all y'all's faces, so I might have killed my child.
Well, because we're on live TV and all that, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of this, and hopefully we'll get the slides to augment and supplement. So one of the most ancient questions, the question we've been discussing here from the beginning, is what is justice?
Monsignor, I am trying to get the slide going, okay?
Sure.
So, I'm working on it on my side. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. This is a first world problem when the technology won't work, but we'll plow ahead. So it goes all the way back to probably most famously Plato's Republic, but it's a question that people ask all the time. What is justice? And historically, we've thought of justice in various ways. One of the most simple ways is to talk about legal justice. What does the law say? And legal justice means following the law. You're just if you do what the law says you must do and don't do what the law says you ought not to do, then you're satisfying the requirements of legal justice. But that is in many ways a minimalistic understanding of justice, because first, the law doesn't encompass everything. And some of the things that the law addresses does so in clumsy ways, and sometimes even in unjust ways. Famously, in our history in the United States, we've had to reform our laws again and again and again because we see that the law itself isn't just. So most social commentators, most people recognize that legal justice doesn't encompass everything we want to address when we talk about having a just community, a just society. So this is where philosophers go to work. And the second part of this that is sometimes referred to as philosophical justice. And that is the kind of justice where we give each person his or her due. We give each person his or her due. And that is a broader understanding. And it also allows us to talk about personal relationships, relationships we have with neighbors, relationship we have with the broader community. And that's, that's served us from the time of Aristotle, most famously made popular in the Christian world through the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, but right up to the modern time. And even philosophers who don't share the Christian intellectual tradition would basically agree that one working definition of justice is giving each person his or her due. So are we able, Anna, yet to get to slide 2? I guess we're still having the same problem, so I'll continue. But quite frankly, even though philosophical justice is a term and an idea that has been embraced by most of the philosophical world, at least in the West, but I would say this is pretty universal. As time has gone on, especially in recent times, when I say recent times, talking about the 20th and 21st century, there's come to recognize that if you want to be more holistic and dive, if you will, deeper into what justice may be defined as, some people who are from the Judeo-Christian background might use the term biblical justice, but a broader, more ecumenical term might be covenantal justice, the justice of the covenant, the justice of community, is to define justice as fidelity to relationships. And this is a more personalistic term. It's a term that encompasses that it isn't just about mathematical division, giving each person his due. You think of paying a wage. A person works X amount of hours, they get X amount of wage in return. It can be very mathematical, giving each person his or her due. This idea of a relationship, a just relationship based on community or on a covenant, on a bond between other persons, sees that persons are in relationship with one another. And because they're in relationship with one another, there's a certain fidelity to those relationships that you need to speak about if you're really going to authentically speak about a just community, a just society, in our case, a just county, a just city. That's that fidelity to relationship. So if justice is defined that way, it is an important part of our pursuit of the common good. And we've talked a lot in our weeks together on this task force about the common good. But I think sometimes we have to define our terms. And so the way that I'm defining the common good, I think this is a pretty straightforward way that most people would agree captures the essence of what the common good is. The common good is the sum total of conditions necessary for each and every person to have ready access to the goods necessary for them to flourish in accordance with one's personal talents, gifts, abilities, and vocation. The sum total conditions necessary for each person to flourish, each and every person to flourish. That means to have ready access to the goods necessary for each and all to live out fully their personal vocation. Now, when I say goods, it's everything from an access to a good education, to the access to the material goods they might need, to the access of the relational goods that they might need. This is what the common is, what we pursue as a society. It's what especially politicians and politics are about, pursuing the common good. And everything we're doing in this task force should help us all contribute better to building up the common good in Wyandotte County. What we're pursuing is what some would call social justice. A society is just if the common good is being pursued and obtained. Some would call this social justice, all right? Social justice is a society where the common good is being pursued and obtained. And any hope of getting to the slides?
It looks like her screen or her presentation is frozen.
Okay. All right. So if that is the definition of the common good, and if the common good is what we're pursuing, and this idea of fidelity relationships so that every person can flourish in accordance with their particular gifts, talents, and vocation, then what do we do about injustices? Now, the injustices happen. They happen by accident, but they also happen by people making immoral choices. So when you look, oh, good, we seem to be moving along here. Great. So I'm on, yeah, there we go. Excellent. So if the injustice is a structural injustice, you transform the structure. So here in Kansas, for example, we are in the process of restructuring some of the governmental programs we have that is based on, for example, taking care of children in foster care. Children in foster care, the system wasn't working. And so we're restructuring and transforming that structure so it will be of greater service to the children who need foster care. If it's a legal injustice, we revise the law. Famously, in the 60s, we had to rewrite a great deal of law to incorporate civil rights in a way that gave them the power, put behind civil rights the power of a more just legal system. If they're distributive, if it's an injustice that has to do with the unfair distribution of resources, then we seek a more equitable distribution. This is kind of straightforward, the different kinds of justice, the different types of justice being addressed. Many more examples could be given, but more to our point, I want to talk about what about injuries, injustices, and harms deliberately chosen? Here we often speak of crime. All right, so it looks like we've got our slides now. And so thank you. I hope we are. So we talked about the common good. The next slide is what to do about injustices. Can we have that? Yeah, I can't change these, so I wish I could, but I can't. So, right, what to do about injustices. There we go. What about injury, injustice, harm suitably chosen? Here we often speak of crime. So we go to the next slide. And the traditional approach to criminal activity is retribution. Some broaden it to include defense and deterrence. So the idea of a traditional approach, if there's an injustice, if there's a crime committed, we say that crime should be punished. All right? The punishment, we say, should reflect the severity of the harm done. All right? The punishment should also act as a defense for the society against the criminal. We incarcerate them. And in doing so, we separate them from society, and that protects society from harm they may want to perpetrate against society. And we also think that punishment should act, or at least we hope, as a deterrent to others, or deterrence to others so inclined. Right? So we think traditionally about punishment of an injustice as retribution, defense, and deterrence. Anna, can you go to that slide? Good, we're on that slide. Now we're going to go to the next one. Can you do that? So enlightened penal codes. In modern times, in addition to retribution, defense, and deterrence, many have recognized the need for punishment also to be reformative. The criminal should have an opportunity to be reformed, right? Thus, many will refer to these four. They'll add the reformation in with retribution, defense, and deterrence. They'll add reformation as the ends or the purposes of criminal punishment. To many people today, judging by budgets and priorities, only the first three are actually essential: retribution, deterrence, and defense. Reformation is basically an afterthought, if thought of at all, though it is there in some of our prison systems. But even if all four are emphasized, even if reformation is given the weight and the funding it's due, where does that leave the victim? Where does that leave the society that has been harmed? Where does that leave the covenant or communal relationships that we spoke about when we talked about justice as fidelity to relationships in a communal setting? This is where a concept that really has grown in the latter part of the 20th and into the 21st century has been developed, and that is restorative justice. Restorative justice, if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. Restorative justice is an approach that tries first to heal and restore the broken relationships that injustices have caused, that injustices deliberately chosen has caused. So we're trying to heal the broken relationship or relationships that the injustices have caused. Right? It is more focused, or at least focused first or primarily, on the victim rather than the perpetrator. If you look at the criminal justice system and say the first thing we must do is punish wrongdoers, you're focusing on the victim. You're focusing on the criminal, the perpetrator. Restorative justice looks first at the victim or victims. It seeks healing and restitution for the victims of crime. Right? It also seeks restoration of the perpetrator, the healing of the community, and the examination of the root causes of criminal or antisocial behavior or activity. Often this will include addressing, through just retribution and reformation, the need for punishment. Doesn't ignore the fact that often punishment is appropriate. But it will also seek a more holistic healing of victim, perpetrator, and the community itself. Restorative justice also is attentive to the difference between crime as such and other pathologies, like addiction and mental illness, that are all too often treated as crimes that need to be punished rather than illnesses that need to be treated. Right? We talked about this in other sessions, that we have a tendency for people who are dealing with addiction or mental illness that their first quote unquote treatment comes after they've perpetrated a crime, because their untreated condition has led them to criminal activity. But restorative justice is not a victim for, pardon me, it's not a perpetrator first, but wants to heal the community and help the victim be restored to wholeness in the process. Next slide, please. I agree with my former colleague at Mount St. Mary's. I made reference to the work that they've done in redemption and restoration. Timothy Wolf is a sociologist. He's a fellow veteran like myself. He was Army, I was Navy. But we did a lot of work together, and I've always been impressed with his efforts. But he, in his writings, he says, and I quote, that the most significant problems in our criminal justice system include, but are not limited to, first, persistent and pernicious racial and class bias. The numbers are pretty clear that disproportionately, people of color and people from the lowest socioeconomic class, and those sometimes overlap in many communities, are disproportionately imprisoned. Second, just one example of that is we know nationwide that Caucasian youth and youth of color use drugs at about the same rate. Study after study after study has shown this. And actually, there might be a little bit more use of misuse of drugs among Caucasian children. But children of color are 5 to 6 times more likely to be imprisoned for drug-related offenses. So there's just one example of where that cultural, racial and class bias comes into play. Second, a so-called war on drugs and resultant mass incarceration that has been devastating to communities and corrupting to our police. Where there are large monies involved, which the illicit drug trade allows, it can be corrupting to the police, but even more so, it has led to huge incarceration numbers that are very expensive. Famously, it costs more to incarcerate someone than it does to send them to Harvard on a full ride for a year. Third, insufficient commitment to rehabilitation and reentry programs, the result of which is high rates of reoffending. And fourth, insufficient attending to the needs of victims of crimes, broadly defined to include the direct victims of crime, the families of victims and offenders, and the local community, all who suffer the impact of crime. So these are, I think, the 4 biggest problems in the criminal justice system as a whole. I agree with Dr. Wolf on this. All of these are better addressed by restorative justice than other approaches. Next slide, please. Restorative justice, as we will see later when people who are practitioners present, it tries to address these issues by a more personalistic and relational approach. You know, pretending that crime has something to do with real people, and people are always, because human persons are best defined as relational beings. Even the ancient Greeks understood that. That's what it meant when what Aristotle meant when he said we're political animals, we're relational beings. So this more relational and personalistic approach, probably the godfather of restorative justice is a Mennonite writer by the name of Howard Zur. He's really the father of these approaches, and this is from his little book of restorative justice. Restorative justice is an approach that involves, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible, to heal relationships and to heal the community. And because I'm a preacher, I cannot help but end on a biblical example. So this is the last slide, if you would, please. It's the biblical example of Jesus and Zacchaeus, a story I love from Luke chapter 19. I love it because, like Zacchaeus, I'm short. Zacchaeus was a short guy. He was a tax collector, and he had an encounter with Jesus. But the encounter with Jesus led to a transformation in his life. But part of that transformation was his recognition that he had been unjust and unfair to many people. And so the first thing that he does after the Lord invites himself to Zacchaeus' house to dine with him, he says, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And Jesus praises him because he said, "Today salvation comes to your house." What Zacchaeus promised to do went way beyond what the law required. The law required him, didn't require him to give half of his possessions to the poor, but yet he was willing to do that. It didn't require him to pay back 4 times the amount. The only time you had to pay 4 times the amount back to someone in the Jewish law of that time was if you did armed robbery, what we would call armed robbery. Zacchaeus had cheated them, but he hadn't robbed them with at the force of using force, unless you, well, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the point is he went way beyond the requirements of the law. Why was that? Because once converted, he recognized that what he had done by being unjust to people was he broke relationships with his very own people, his very own community in Jericho where he lived. And what he wanted to do was restore those relationships and go more than what the law required. That's an example of someone who gets it, that what they've done is harm the community, and the community needs to be healed. And part of that will be their actions to make restitution to people they have harmed. So I'll stop there because I just wanted to give, or was asked to give, a theoretical introduction to what we're talking about when we talk about restorative justice. And I apologize, we had a little trouble with the technology, but I hope that wasn't too distracting.
All right, thank you, Monsignor Swetland. We'll receive any questions from any of the task force members to this very informative presentation.
Monsignor, we're going to hear a couple of examples. Are there examples that you're aware of restorative justice programs in regards to what would involve police or law enforcement participation, and just some idea about how this has been applied practically?
Yep. All right, so the most famous example of restorative justice is post-apartheid South Africa, okay? So Mandela, when he became the president, brilliantly recognized that there was need for great healing in South Africa because of the countless injustices associated with apartheid. So the Reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that he established used restorative justice techniques in healing the community in Southern Africa. That's probably the most famous example. The second most famous is after the peace accords in Northern Ireland. Restorative justice techniques were used in partially restoring that community that had been so devastated by strife between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. So those are probably the 2 most famous international cases. But it's been used a great deal in places like Elkhart, Indiana, Washington, D.C., in Ontario, in Chicago, and in many other places dealing with juvenile offenders, trying to keep people who are starting down the wrong path, trying to turn them back to the right path. And if their crimes don't raise to a certain level, work through a restorative process. So it's been used a lot in those settings. It's also been used in school settings where schools have had high instances of activity that could rise to the level of crime. So there's numerous school districts that have implemented it as well. It's also been, in Chicago, for example, they targeted the 18 to 24-year-old first offenders in the 18 to 24 with the mindset, and they got this from the insurance business. Why is it that automobile insurance goes down at 25 for men, at least in our society. And that's because the industry has recognized that at 25, men become much more fully developed in their choices they make. Men take a while to mature. So the 18 to 24-year-old insurance agencies recognize that they're not fully formed yet. And so they have had some success with targeting that group to using restorative justice techniques. East Europe used some of them, restorative justice techniques, in reconciling those who had been involved with the communist governments that had oppressed people in places like East Germany and some of the other behind the Iron Curtain as well. This, because of all the international work, the United Nations actually did a basic principles on the use of restorative justice programs in criminal matters. They did a major work on this and passed a resolutions in 2002 that talked about, here are the principles that we think work. And just to quote from that document, it's a long document, but to quote just one example, restorative processes means any process in which the victim and the offender, and where appropriate, any other individuals or community members affected by a crime participate together actively in the resolution of matters arising from the crime, generally with the help of a facilitator. Restorative processes may include mediation, conciliation, conferencing, and sentencing circles. So there is a lot of work done, at least on the international level, but there's also applications in some of the places I just mentioned.
Any other questions?
Monsignor Evelyn, I just wanted to know, you mentioned deliberate injustices. Yep. And so if you were to just name 2 or 3 ways we could literally heal our community here in Wyandotte County, what would those be? Just to initiate a beginning process. What would 2, 3, 4 of those processes be?
Right. Well, first, I think we can learn from Nelson Mandela and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that an important part of their process was to state out loud the injustice. So if a person had been involved in doing injustice, they had to own up to the fact that they had done so. So personally, I think one of the things we should do in Wyandotte County is admit very openly some of the past injustices that the community has suffered. One great example is the historical injustice of redlining that devastated certain parts of our community. I have been pretty adamant, and I've done this from the pulpit in various places, talking about the process of white flight, as it was called, and how devastating it was, the extraction of capital and wealth, both human capital and wealth, from our communities, and how that was systematically done and encouraged by covenant communities that were explicitly racist. I think we have to own up to what that has done to our communities and the lack of historical investment. When it comes to police and policing, we have, unfortunately, some historical known cases of gross injustices that have hurt communities and made certain communities rightfully very wary of the people who are there supposedly to protect and serve. But when we have had these historical cases, they haven't always been owned up to in a way that makes us say, there they are. And I think part of any healthy community is be able to say, about the injustices that have happened. And I'll just be very personal about this. As a Catholic priest, we're going through this process in the Catholic Church because historically there were some gross injustices that the church hierarchy did not handle very well. And we weren't very honest about it. And we are now facing that. And one of the things we're doing is trying as best we can to make amends for that reality. And so this is something that's every community needs to do it. I just think we have to own those injustices.
Before we get any more questions, I do see persons from the community that are wanting to ask questions, I will point you towards an email address, and that email address is cprtaskforce@wycokck.org. Again, that's CPR Task Force, all one word, at wycokck.org. And we will be happy to answer questions from the community as well. I think I saw Mr. Smart. Did you have your hand up?
Yes. Monsignor, I have a question regarding your presentation. So do you believe that restorative justice will bring about the need for reparations? And if so, if a community wanted reparations for those wrongdoings after those wrongdoings were admitted to, what would those reparations look like?
Yeah. Well, I do think that part of this is what is called in specific cases restitution. In more general cases can be reparations. Obviously, it's this goes beyond the scope of this task force, but the example I just used of redlining, because wealth was either denied or extracted or both from certain communities over a long period of time. That means, in my opinion, that the first that should be served by our community is those who were most oppressed or most had to deal with the greatest injustice. And so that would mean that our resources as a community, that those communities would have if you will, should have a first cut or first say at as we apply resources in our community to them. It also means that we have to try to make up as a community some of the things that were lost in those communities when it comes to schooling and social services and other things. So those communities have a certain right to these things. It's not just to be nice, they actually have a right to it because of the past injustice.
We can't hear you, Commissioner.
I'm going to get it one of these days. Learn how to mute and unmute. I appreciate that presentation, Monsignor. I think it was very informative and really set the basis for our discussion today. I see our mayor has joined us, and Mayor, certainly, would you like to have introductory comments? Okay.
I just think, Monsignor, presentation, as always, it's very challenging. And Dr. Hill, it really struck me. We've had a couple of conversations, I think, already about, the need for us to acknowledge the past injustices. And so as a first step, but certainly not the only step. So I think that's a conversation for the task force about what might that look like, practically speaking.
Yeah, agreed. In the interest of time, we're going to move to our next presentation, which is by Mr. Elder Barbie. I see you now, Elder Stephen Barbie, along with Elder Randy George with the Village Initiative here in Wyandotte County. Elder Barbie and Elder George, it's in your hands at this time.
All right. First of all, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for allowing the Village Initiative to be a part of this great challenge for the city of Wyandotte County and Kansas City, Kansas. Elder George is sitting here with me. My name is Stephen Barbie. I am the community outreach specialist here at the Village Initiative. And of course, as we have, I want to tell those that have already shared, I thank you for the challenge. But as the angle that the village is going to take is the angle of the returning citizens. When we think about those that are returning back to Wyandotte County, those that are getting released, even as we speak, from Kansas Department of Correction, from Wyandotte County Jail, those that are returning back home from the federal system. And so when we look at our presentation, our angle is going to be, of course, Black Lives Matters, but those that means justice involved. When you say the word justice involved, for some, it may mean just those getting out of prison, but I believe that justice involved includes the husbands, the wives, the sons, the daughters, the family members, but most of all, justice involved includes our community, because it affects all of us in one way or another. And so if you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I was afraid of that, but we're okay. Go back to the returning citizens and I'll flow. So when you look at, there we go. So when you look at that, okay, the climate of the criminal justice regarding the returning citizens, first of all, some of the things that we've even asked those that come through our doors, when they see a police officer, when they see a sheriff, when they see someone in uniform, what is your thoughts? Now, mind you, we're coming from a returning citizens perspective. First of all, the first thing that goes through their mind is lack of trust. A lack of trust. And then they have the moments of anxiety. The moments of anxiety. Because when we ask those and the climate and the tone and the temperature of returning citizens, there was a fear factor. There's a fear factor. Even if they're not doing any type of criminal activity, seeing a police officer at Walmart in uniform, it gives them fear. One of the main things now across, not only here in Kansas City, Kansas, and across this great state of Kansas and across our country, discrimination. I mean, if we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, let's talk about it today. Discrimination and racial profiling. Of course, the social media and the news across this country, in the morning when I wake up and watch Channel 4 News, it's always about those that got killed last night. So you have that and racial profiling. And of course, the citizens are looking at death. That when they encounter the law, have you ever thought about that? That if you and I go to Gates or another fine restaurant here in Kansas City and we come out after having a fine meal and we see a police officer, do you think about death? But that's the mindset of the returning citizens. And then of course, their mindset is this here, a negative encounter, not positive, a negative. These are the thoughts and the feelings that those that are on probation here in Wyandotte County, those that are on parole in Wyandotte County, those that are on diversion programs. Another thing that they have is they don't have no confidence in the legal system. Not some confidence, or not none, zero. And then this one here, it really baffled me, excessive force. They believe that when they encounter the law, they're going to deal with some force, but excessive force. Unjust stops. You fit the profile. You know, word on the street. Your tail light was out. You crossed the center line. Now, these are our citizens. Our Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas, Quindaro, Parallel, State Street. They're coming home. This is what they're thinking. And not only that, but their past criminal biases. Their thinking is that Wyandotte County is saying you can't change. And so the prejudice that is placed upon individuals returning back home to Wyandotte County, these are some of the thoughts and feelings. My next slide. I know you can't see it, but I'm gonna keep flowing here. trust or lack of trust. You see, to have no trust or confidence at all. I'm talking about those in the system. According to those returning back home, they believe racial profiling is the norm. They believe that when they see a person in uniform, that they're going to misuse their authority. You know, trust is broken. If we ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, and 1 being low and 10 being high, how well do you trust the law? How well do you trust the judicial system? Negative. -2. As we look at everything that's going on in our community and everything going on in our society, you talk about racial profiling, you're talking about the hurts, because racial profiling, it hurts all of our community. It hurts our community as a whole. It affects relationships. It affects the community relationships. It affects the community engagement. And watch this one here. It affects the community involvement with the police officer. A statement was made that it violates my rights to even to live, work, or play. How many times have you driven around Kansas City, Kansas? I just did this afternoon, and the parks are empty. I remember growing up, the parks were a place to play and a place of engagement, a place of families. But it's interesting, when I drive through Kansas City, Kansas, most parks are empty. Why? Because they're not a place of safe haven anymore. And then when you talk about the use of racial profiling, it is a grounds for suspecting someone committed a crime. They suspect it. They didn't commit a crime, but they suspect it. Take your hands out your pocket. I got to go off my script, but the last time I got pulled over by a police officer, and I want to thank the law enforcement, and I want to thank all the pastors and leaders. My brother, he's a police officer. But the last time I actually got pulled over, I had to give a play-by-play. I made a left-hand turn. The sign was covered by some trees. I did make the illegal left-hand turn, but I had to give a play-by-play to the police officer to say, yes, my registration and insurance is in my glove box. May I reach for it? He allowed me to reach for it. He asked me for my driver's license. And I said, sir, I do have a driver's license, but it is in my wallet, and my wallet is in my back pocket. May I reach for it? A play-by-play. Because the world we live in now, it could have been a life or death if I would have made a sudden move. And so the fear factor played a part in my life when I got pulled over the last time by law enforcement. So what are some of the other factors? You got the discrimination factors, you got race, and you got gender. You have also, you got our culture, right? What neighborhood? Matter of fact, what color car you're driving. All of these barriers brings biases. Let's be honest, all of us have a sense of racism and a sense of prejudice in our own personal lives. Let's just be honest. You know, I'm a Cowboys fan. So y'all watch out, y'all Chiefs. You know, I'm biased. I like the Cowboys, right? And so when I see a Chiefs by me, I have to say, because I'm a Cowboys fan, it's kind of hard for me, even though I live in Kansas City, that's my bias. So we all have our own personal biases. And so when you think about that, and when you think about our upbringings, and when you think about our culture, sometimes it's this here. It's what the individual has experienced in their past. that's the thing is, you don't know what they've experienced, because all of us have dealt with trauma in one shape, form, or fashion. So then let's just throw it out there, white privilege. People don't want to address it, but it's true. People got offended because I said Black Lives Matter. I said, let me change that. I am Black and my life matters. Because the thing of it is that I didn't choose to be born African American, but God created me in this skin color. And so he equipped me to face the challenge of life. People say, well, what about private protesting and looting and all of that, right? They have a right to do that. But as we close out here, and I wish they could post it up there, we talk about Mayberry, RFD. You're like, why Mayberry? Mayberry, we talked about it as we was discussing it yesterday. What was so impactful about Mayberry? How come their crime was very low? One is because the people communicated through relationships. Everybody knew one another. See, the community police Mayberry. There was a couple of perception, right? You see, because Barney Fife, right? His perception, he thought because of his badge and his gun, it gave him the feeling of authority. He thought because of what he had on, I had authority. But see, Andy knew he had authority from his position and he did not abuse it. And his relationship that he had with the citizens of Mayberry. Those relationships in Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas, has been broken and severed. You see, you have to understand something from an African-American culture. And when people say, I'm not killing, I ain't talking to the police, I ain't, right? It's a cultural thing. Because when I was brought up and raised in my household, my dad's a pastor, Pastor Leo Barbie, Lawrence, Kansas. My mom was an educator. There was a saying in our house, what goes on in this house, what? Stays in this house, right? That's a cultural thing. So what has happened in our community is what goes on in our community stays in our community. We have to break that cultural mindset because there's things going on in our community right now that we're not willing to, as they say, tell the police. It's like I tell individuals, do wrong on my street, I'm calling the police. I'm sorry. Why? Because I'm a law-abiding citizen. But you got to understand, some of the individuals in Wyandotte County don't believe that they're a law-abiding citizen. So first of all, we're going to have to open up dialogue and talk to hear one another out. And this is it. Are we really ready for real change? In order for us as a community to have real change, first of all, let's deal with the issues. Let's deal with the insight and bring all of our professionalism and all of our experiences to the table. And finally, if we do the first two I's, we will make an impact here in Wyandotte County. Some of the issues: no trust, no protection, no justice, no peace. See, the insight is this here. To be honest, there is two different justice systems, but it shouldn't be. Let's just call it like it is. Because when you think about mass incarceration and those that are getting locked up in the Kansas Department of Correction, where we can pay $24,000 plus a year to keep somebody locked up, or those that are going into the federal system where we could spend over $36,000 to keep them locked up. If you could spend that much money to lock somebody up, invest in the community to keep them out. How? Through programming, through networking, to having surrounded wraparound services, right? but to make an impact, right? Our children, the education, employment, housing, mass incarceration. These are some of the issues that it is affecting our community. And also this here, additional training for trauma-informed care, testing with implicate bias testing, creating a focus group with the community to develop systems of accountability and transparency in the hiring practices of our law enforcement. I just want to say, these are just a starting point as we represent our returning citizens coming back home to Wyandotte County. I believe that this will be a launching pad for us as a task force to look at change, embrace change, and see change happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barbie. We would entertain any questions or discussions from the task force members at this time.
Question.
Go ahead.
So you had made a statement during your presentation about kind of the policing and how it's being policed inside of our community. So I was wondering if you were referring to or saying that only police from our community should be policing our community. And if that is the case, how would you assure the success of that in your own opinion? How would you assure the success of hiring police officers in a community where there isn't much trust, as you said, and getting people to actually want to partake in becoming a police officer in our community?
Yeah. Start at a very what? So I'm just getting a handoff here from Elder George. He said the policing needs to start at a very young age. The relationships. And how is that? You know, we have to have those relationships, you know, and we have to go now to daycares. I mean, our babies know about police officers. We need to start educating them at a very young age with positive relationships, positive. And then as you begin to look at the hiring process, you know, sometimes you may have to raise the requirements. I don't know exactly what the requirements are here in Wyandotte County, I could be honest, but I do know, like the deputies out in Johnson County, they go through the law enforcement training. You know, maybe they need to have education. Maybe they need to have some type, I don't know. But the thing of it is that we need to have more policing within the community. You know, where you know, they try to say for safety reasons, all that, you know, but are they living in the community? Or are they living one block away from Johnson County, just far enough out to say I live in Wyandotte County? My brother is a police officer in Kansas City, Missouri. He lives in the hood. The people on the block know him. They respect him. And so we have to just be more involved and have a more police and law enforcement presence.
We have to say to Sheriff Ash, who has reached out to the community, the more minorities, we appreciate that. We respect that. And we're working diligently to help in that effort.
And I just got passed another word, Elder George, Sheriff Ash, and then, you know, we want to thank you, but having more minorities, the request for more minorities to be hired on the law enforcement here in Wyandotte County. I see another hand. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. And I thought it was creative. I printed it out here with Andy and Barney. Yeah, I think there's a good example that Barney was, you know, by the book, but often wrong, where Andy was more about relationships. So speaking about restorative justice, more into that. But something you said as an aside really caught my attention. I've been trying to get my mind around it since you said it, which is about our parks being empty, especially now with COVID, when, you know, that's one of the few places we can use, though we can't use sometimes all the equipment. That's something, as someone who's not originally from here hadn't noticed before, that had changed. You know, what can we do about that? Because it seems to me we've got wonderful parks, and put resources into those. And it would be a great place for the community to interact, as the community can interact. So, you know, that seems to be a low-hanging fruit of something we can address. So what's going on there? You talked a little bit about some people feeling unsafe in parks, but also some other things. So what would be some steps, in your opinion, or your thoughts to righting that wrong?
Well, one, of course, I would develop or implement just community meetings where people are heard. You know, no need to defend. I just want to be heard. You know, I know growing up sometimes my parents would say, be quiet. But I think here in Wyandotte County, the system has said time and time again, be quiet. I think they just want to be heard. You know, what are some of the law enforcement? What are some of your fears? What are some of your biases? You know, is it because I got a Cadillac? I mean, let's just get 100 and keep it real in a safe environment so that people can truly express themselves and have an open dialogue. And I believe that if, you know, to have it on the schedule, you know, to go to each community or each zip code, you know, KCK, downtown, you know, Argentine, you know, and just begin to have open community forums where people can come and just share without feeling, you know, threatened, without feeling challenged, and say, you know what, they heard me.
One of the things that...
Mr. Barbie, this is Evelyn. One quick question. You said something similar to this. She said, are we really ready for real change? Mm-hmm. Can you describe in a little more detail what you mean?
First of all, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to see change? And then we have to ask ourselves, what will change look like? You know, when the stigma is placed upon individuals, you know, they're coming home, you know, we got to look at the recidivism rate, which is that 3-year window on individuals that comes back to Wyandotte County, that window that we watch and monitor them to see if they create any new crimes, break their violation, they're going back, right? So we're going to monitor them. The system monitors them. Sometimes our bias says they'll never change, right? But we have to be open and give individuals coming back to Wyandotte County the opportunity to change.
Their perception of the police department has to change. Currently, they're considered an enemy. How do we build relationships?
And Elder George is saying we need to build relationships of trust. Do you trust me? You know, I'll just be honest, you know, 8.5 years ago, I got out of federal prison. I got sentenced right downtown 500 Kansas Avenue. I did 44 months of federal time. I got out, got off paper early, got 12 years of being clean and sober, got my record expunged. Why? Because I began to work here because somebody sat and listened to me and gave me a chance. And because of that, I know that we can, if we truly work at it, we truly can see change coming. First of all, and I'm gonna close with this one, we need to invite them to the table because they don't feel invited to the table.
You might state that one in our session, one of the ex-offenders said they would just like to get them with the police.
And Elder George, as we said, individuals that came through our front door says, I just want to get to know the police officers so they can know me. And it's about building relationships.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hill, for that question.
Mr. Barbie, you know, I talked with Randy, and I know what happens at the Village Initiative, but in your experience there in that ministry, what, you know, I know you provide a lot of wraparound services, but it seems to me that so much, when it's effective, when you're able to help individuals, you know, transition back into the community and become back as returning citizens, it's the relationships you build that they feel that they have some place and someone to turn to. And but what is that? What is it that makes this, when it works for an individual, what makes it work?
Well, what makes it work is building a trust relationship. You know, once they can trust you and they can trust me, then we can start building relationships. You know, what happens is the system gives them the to-do list. You do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. While I was in prison, do this, do this, do this, do this. But when they get out, we have to instruct or show individuals what is healthy doing. Because a lot of them never experience things that you and I have. Going to a Royals game, going to a Chiefs game, going out to Legends, going to the theater. So they need to see other opportunities on how to live. For some, the barriers are much stronger and much higher for other individuals. I mean, the small barriers that they have to experience is, you know, to get a birth certificate, you need an ID. To get an ID, you need a social security card. To get a social security card, now they're running around in circles instead of making their transition back home a lot more easier. If they can give you a care package going in, the shower shoes, toothpaste and that to go in, there should be a care package waiting for every individual coming back home to Wyandotte. And I believe what should be in that care package is an ID, a birth certificate, a social security card, those essentials. They can't start working without that. They can't start a whole lot of things in their lives. And if Wyandotte County, if one of the things that you say is, listen, for every returning citizen, your care package will be waiting at the village, your birth certificate, your ID, and your social security card. I believe that they will say, well, where did we get this from? And we could say, the city of Wyandotte County says, welcome home.
Amen. Share with them the young man that had the perception that his criminal record.
Yeah. Yeah. One last thing. We had a gentleman just here this afternoon, and he said because of his criminal background, he didn't feel worthy. He felt that when he's in a conversation, they know that I'm a felon. When he gets opportunities, they know. And so the thing of it is that the perception, because they feel off of their feelings. And if that is true, then they already got their negative feeling, and all of a sudden their wall goes up. And so I just believe for us to just start and say, listen, we're going to start having monthly open forums to the community just to come and share their hearts. I believe that that would be a great place for us here in Wyandotte County to begin.
You, Mr. Barbie, we appreciate that. And for Elder George, the vital work that you all are doing here in Wyandotte County is very instrumental and very necessary. So we appreciate it, and we want to continue to see you all do the fine work that you are doing here in Wyandotte County. It's not easy work, but you all are definitely a shining star to a lot of persons that are out in the community.
Elder George and I, we both say thank you for the opportunity that you gave the village here on this afternoon to share. But thank you all very much. Thank you.
You're
Hey,
welcome.
Commissioner Johnson,
Yes.
this is Gordon. I had a question. I was intrigued by what Elder George and Elder Barbie was saying about the care package. And it seems like that's doable because if an individual is getting ready to be paroled we know that, or the Kansas Department of Corrections knows that. Is there a way, Elder George and Elder Bobby, to start that conversation in advance of someone getting paroled so that they can have that care package, or at least work that care package while they're preparing to be paroled, so when they get home, they already have it? And I guess where I'm headed is, if you can get the person that's potentially getting ready to be paroled to learn to fish by doing some of this, when they get out, they will already have learned a little bit about how the system works and what kind of things they need. Seems like that's doable. That's how would we start that at the KDOC level? Because it seems like that's where it would need to be initiated.
Brother Johnson, Commissioner Johnson, this is Pastor Carter.
Yes.
I think Brother Gordon, Brother Criswell brings up a good point, and I think that certainly needs to be delved into. But it seems to me we've got another presenter, and this, restorative justice is certainly an area that we need to deal with, but that's talking about getting people back in. We're talking about our main issue right now is people who are being brutally dealt with because of the color of their skin. And I know a lot of those people that Elder George and Brother Barbie are having to deal with, maybe that was some of their experiences as to why they're there. And we do need to help be a part of getting them re-engaged in the community. But it seems to me that our role as a task force now is to deal with people being racially profiled, all of those things that he brought up that we're dealing with, being discriminated against, dealing the negative encounters they're having. Those are the kind of things that we're trying to prevent. And that I see as more of our role. And maybe the next presenter will help us deal with some of that as well. Just a thought.
No, I don't disagree with you. Everything is so interwoven. But I do agree with, in terms of timelines, we do want to hear from Mr. Stapleton. So again, I appreciate that. And Gordon, maybe we can follow up with the folks over at Village and kind of work through those things as well. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Mr. Stapleton, who is with Stapleton and Associates here, and he's going to give us a presentation. And we appreciate your patience there, Mr. Stapleton, but it's all in your hands at this time. Thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, sir. I appreciate being here. Thank you for inviting me. I want to thank my wife, who is standing right here, who happens to be my boss. So her name is Linda Stapleton. She's right here with me. She helped me put together this presentation. Here she is.
You got one of those too, huh?
Yeah, she's my boss. Okay. I want to, first of all, say that I was raised in a small town. It was like a Mayberry. And my favorite character from the Andrew Griffith Show was Clarence, who had his own key to the jail. If you remember that. He had his own key to the jail. He knew exactly where it was. And that was something that I carry with me, because I was raised in Liberty, Missouri, which is a very small town. It was very segregated at the time that I was there. And even though all the laws had been changed to more inclusion for Black folks, it was still very difficult for us. And then when we moved to Kansas City, it was more like the Monsignor talked about. There was a lot of white flight. You know, we moved to Kansas City about the same time that Dr. King was killed. And when Dr. King was killed, there was a lot of white flight out of Kansas City, out of our neighborhood. So we have experienced a lot of discrimination, a lot of issues, but we're going to talk about restorative justice today, all right? And first I want to talk about what Monsignor, I want to follow up with what Monsignor talked about, Howard Zare. Howard Zare was one of his mentors, Howard Zare was one of the people that was instrumental in bringing restorative justice to the United States. Howard Zare is a retired professor from Eastern Mennonite University. And he is the one who was very, very instrumental in bringing restorative justice to the United States. And his restorative justice was formed basically from the indigenous people from the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. They brought him the ideas of restorative justice before it was actually called restorative justice. And one of the books that Lamont Singer talked about was the little book of restorative justice. Can you see that? And this is almost like the Bible of restorative justice. And it's written by Professor Howard Zare. And I got a chance to meet Professor Zare. I was a practicing lawyer for 30 years. And a lot of those times I thought, what could we do to make the system better? I became a mediator. I mediated over 300 cases as a mediator and as a lawyer. And I thought, what can we do to make the system better? And then one day I discovered restorative justice. And I discovered Howard Zare, Professor Zare, who's now retired. And I would I got his phone number, and I contacted Professor Zare. And I said, Professor Zare, please tell me more about this restorative justice. And this was about 10 years ago. And Professor Zare told me all about restorative justice. He talked about the book that I just showed you, the little book of restorative justice. And he talked about all of the little books in the series of restorative justice. And so what I did was I got the books and I studied the books. And I had more and more questions for Professor Zare. So I would contact Professor Zare on a regular basis. And pretty soon he would say, well, John, I'm retired. Can you get the answers from somebody else? I said, well, Professor Zare, I'm gung-ho for restorative justice, and I want to know more about restorative justice. So he pointed me in the right direction, and I became very obsessed with restorative justice. I love restorative justice because it is a viable alternative to the criminal justice system. And we're going to talk about retributive justice, which Lamont Singer touched upon. We're going to talk about retributive justice versus restorative justice. Our system nowadays, our system for the last 200 years has been retributive justice. Retributive justice is basic to the criminal justice system, okay? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first of all, we want to talk about restorative justice is a philosophy for the police and the community to make amends. Because the police and the Black community have been at odds for several, not only decades, but for several centuries. The police, one of the reasons that we have a police departments, is because of the Black community, because of the exclusion of the Black community. That is one of the reasons that we have a police department. If we didn't have this exclusionary factor in this country, not only in Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County, or Jackson County, or anywhere else, is because of the exclusionary factor, okay? Now, restorative justice is a philosophy for police and the Black community and the Hispanic community and the white community to make amends. It's time to put an end to the Floyd situations. It's time to put an end to the situations out of Baltimore, Maryland, Ferguson, Missouri. You name it, there are unjust situations all over this country. The most prominent one has been the George Floyd situation. George Floyd was killed, and that has started all kinds of protest movements. But what we don't realize is we've had protest movements since I was born. I talked to my mother about that when I was a baby, when I was a child. Why are we not the same why are we not treated the same? I went to segregated schools, even though Brown versus Board of Education was in full force. I went to segregated schools. And then we started to integrate. But by then, everything was, the system was already in place. But we started to change. Change is slow. It's always going to be slow. It will always be slow from here on in. But we need to make the changes now. There should not be any more overt George Floyd types of situations. And that's what we're going to address with restorative justice. Now, there are other issues with George Floyd. There are other issues with George Floyd that I experienced myself as a trial lawyer. When I was a criminal trial lawyer, there were experiences that I had that are similar to the George Floyd incident. In other words, the police officer that was charged with murdering George Floyd may have the charges dismissed against him. That's something that a lot of folks have not thought about. He may have the charges dismissed against him because George Floyd had significant amounts of illegal drugs in the system. Now, a good criminal trial lawyer for the police officer will say, that's what killed him. And as a trial lawyer myself, I've used that defense. I had a client who was charged with vehicular manslaughter, drunk driving, vehicular manslaughter. His passenger was killed in the incident. She was killed. She was his best friend. She was killed in the incident. They charged him with vehicular manslaughter, which is a Class B felony. A Class B felony, which is not a Class A felony or a capital felony. Class B felony is a lower felony, but it's still a felony. And he felt terrible because his friend died in that crash. Well, we looked a little closer at the situation, and sure, she died, but did she die in the crash, or did she die before the crash? Similar to the George Floyd situation, we checked into her hospital records. We checked into her blood alcohol content. And we found out that her blood alcohol content put her in a position while she was alive where she could have been alcohol poisoned. And if she was alcohol poisoned, if that's how she died, she didn't die in the wreck. And if she didn't die in the wreck, he shouldn't be charged with vehicular manslaughter. But that is a situation, I bring it up because that is a situation that could have been handled had I known then. It could have been handled through restorative justice. Because the woman who was killed, who died, she was his best friend. And even though the charges were dismissed against him for vehicular manslaughter, he suffered with that because he never got the opportunity to address her family. He never got an opportunity to address the victim's family. And see, that is one of the drawbacks of the retributive system. And the Monsignor talked about it, and Mr. Barbie talked about it. The victims are non-existent. Once the system gets what they want out of the victims, they cast the victims to the side. Once they get enough information to convict a person, such as the guy that I represented, they will toss the victim to the side. We don't need you anymore. But that is a big difference between the retributive system and the criminal and the restorative justice system. The victim comes first in restorative justice, always has come first. And that was one of the things that Mr. Zaire, Professor Zaire, one of the things that he brought out that made me open my eyes to take a look at restorative justice. The victim is first. The community is second. because everybody is affected by criminal behavior. Everybody is. Not only the victim and the community, but also the offender. The offender is also part of this. But in the criminal justice system or the retributive justice system, the criminal or the offender is the only one that is dealt with. And in the criminal justice system or the retributive justice system, however you want to classify it, the only purpose is to punish that person. To punish that person. I have a brother who spent 18 years incarcerated. 18 years incarcerated. But just like Mr. Barbie talked about, he was not rehabilitated. He went into prison without even a high school diploma. And he did not receive any assistance while he was in prison to get his high school diploma. He would call me and we would talk. I said, well, you need to start working on this. Well, there's no resources for him. He was incarcerated for 18 years, was released last year. A very sad situation, but I've gotten off the topic. We're going to talk next about restorative community relations. Restorative community relations belong to the community, and it deals basically with our relationship with the police department. There can be such a great relationship. I've envisioned that, a great relationship between the community, not only the Black community or the Hispanic community, but the entire community with the police department. And it will make things so much better for all of us. It means that those victims, the community, the police department, and the offenders are the best people to discuss what happened during criminal activity. These are the best people to talk to. And we can bring all of these people together in restorative justice, in the same room, at the same time. We can invite everybody to the system, not to the system. We can invite everybody to the restorative justice circle. We have the facilitator here. The facilitator is someone who is not involved, but who will bring all the people together under one roof at the same time. The prime example of this was a situation in Seattle, Washington. Seattle, Washington, a few years ago, I think it was in 2009 or 2010, an Indian or indigenous person was killed by a police officer. The first thing they did was they started a restorative justice circle to address that issue. But see, that was a reaction. A restorative justice could also be brought, a circle could be put together for not only reaction, but proactive activity, which is what Mayor Alvey had talked about and other people have talked about. You bring people together before any type of problem, any type of criminal activity, any type of racial injustice. You bring people together to discuss it. And you can do that. There are several cities all over this country. For example, Annapolis, Maryland, which is right outside of Baltimore. Annapolis, Maryland has a pretty quiet community. Then Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, Maryland a few years ago. Freddie Gray wasn't killed in Annapolis, he was killed in Baltimore. But Annapolis was not really affected by this, but they did start a proactive movement. A proactive movement can head everything off at the pass. Everything can be headed off at the pass in a proactive movement. And that is something that Mayor Alvey and cities and communities across the country, could really get into, because this is something that will head everything off at the path. And the task force that you guys have put together is amazing, because you can get together and discuss some of these issues that have occurred in Baltimore, St. Louis, Minnesota, and now Portland, Kenosha, Wisconsin. You can get together and discuss these issues, and before there are any deaths, any injuries, these issues can be dealt with through restorative justice conferencing, through restorative justice circles. And one of the things we're going to learn is that the old paradigms are no longer working. They're not working anymore. The criminal justice system, as we know it, has been malfunctioned for as long as we can remember. The criminal justice system in the United States, Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County, all over, it hasn't worked. It has not worked at all. And it never will under the present guidelines, under the present system. It will not work. Restorative justice can address that. The civil protests that are going on now across the country that have been building and building and building, they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop until this whole issue has been addressed. Restorative justice calls for continuing change in the communities, continuing dialogue, but you have to get started. And the first thing you can do, just like Mayor Alvey has done, put together this task force. This is a great idea. I love this idea. This task force could do so much for the community. And not only the community in Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Wyandotte County, all over the state of Kansas. Because I went to school in Kansas, I went to Manhattan, I went to school at K-State. I went to school at K-State before Bill Snyder. I went to K-State in the dog days, where we played Nebraska in Manhattan, and it looked like a Nebraska home game, because we couldn't even draw 5,000 people to our stands. When Nebraska came, it looked like a Nebraska home game, because they were only 2.5 hours away. And whenever they traveled to Manhattan, or even to Lawrence, they would bring loads and loads of people dressed in red. It looked like, my daddy would say, it looks like a Nebraska home game. And then after Bill Snyder came to Manhattan, we started to draw purple into the stands. And my wife and I went to the games in the early 2000s, and we took pictures for my dad. He couldn't believe it. 55,000 people dressed in purple in the stands at KSU. It was a sight to behold. Anyway, there are problems in Manhattan. There are problems in Lawrence. There are problems all over this country. So a proactive type of situation, as Mayor Alvey has put together, it can work. It could bring the relations close, it could bring the races, and it could bring the communities closer and closer together. It can work. I got very excited when he asked me to make this presentation. I got very excited because I love what's going on in Wyandotte County. Some of the stuff I'm going over, the Monsinger's already talked about, and so is Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Stapleton, can I interrupt real quick here?
Absolutely.
When you talk about continuing dialogue, one of the things that we've heard in terms of maybe pushback from the community is we've had enough dialogue. Some would say we already know what the problems are. You know, we've been dealing with this for decades, and someone said maybe centuries.
You're
So
breaking up.
what's the point of having continued dialogue if when we need action? What would you, okay, some would say, what's the point of having continued dialogue when we already know what the issues are? What would your response be to that?
I would say, sir, I would say that, Commissioner Johnson, that we have not had the right kind of dialogue. A restorative dialogue is not something that has been happening in Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County. It has not been a restorative dialogue. It has not brought the people together. It has not been a continuing dialogue, because this is not something that's going to happen and go away overnight. It will never do that. But it has to start. It has to start. A restorative dialogue is something that I've never seen before. Not in Wyandotte County, not in Jackson County, where I'm from. I've never seen a restorative dialogue, and that is something that we can address, because it can get to the heart of the issue. And one of the things that I learned as a trial lawyer, I learned about something called psychodrama. Psychodrama can help you also get to the basics of the problem, where you can talk about. I mean, I learned this at, you're probably familiar with Jerry Spence. He's a trial lawyer at Wyoming. He has a trial lawyers college, and one of the things he talks about, one of the subjects is psychodrama, where you get to the heart of the story. That is something that can be included in any restorative justice dialogue session. I mean, there are 5 different components. There's a chair backing component. There's a face-to-face component. And there are 3 other components I'm not familiar with. I can't think of right now, but they're all components to bring people together, to bring the truth out, and to deal with the truth once it hits the fan. Once it hits the table, you deal with the truth. And like I was telling you, it may not be something that's going to happen overnight, but it can happen. It's happening all over the country. It's happening in Seattle, Washington, where the indigenous person was killed. Okay, that was something that occurred. It was about 10, 15 years ago, I think. There was an Indian fellow. He was a wood carver who was killed by a police officer, and they convened a restorative justice circle to address that issue. And although the police officer was exonerated, the police officer, the charges were dropped against him, the family of the wood carver received a settlement of $2 million. That will never bring the person back again. But it was something that they started, they put it together. And now it's a very different issue in Seattle, Washington.
Mr. Stapleton, could you explain again, or kind of get into, in terms of, policing, restorative justice that you are describing, how does that affect, and what changes does it require from, let's say, from within law enforcement itself? What are the practicalities of this, in other words, if that makes sense? Because again, to get back to what Reverend Carter was saying, we're talking about how do you stop, racial profiling? How do you stop the implicit bias? How do you stop those things from playing itself out within law enforcement? And how was restorative justice, how would it affect that?
Okay, well, the first thing you do is you do the restorative justice circles, all right? You invite the police department, you invite the community, you invite people who have been affected by racial profiling, you invite people from the majority communities, you invite people from the Hispanic communities, you get everybody together and you get them into a restorative justice circle with a facilitator who has no dog in the fight. You get the facilitator there and you bring all the people together and you hash out all the issues. You find out why this is happening. I mean, it may not be personal at all. It may not be something where any police officer in the Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County, any of the sheriff deputies, it may not be something that any of these people have experienced, but it's there. It's going to be there forever until it starts to get addressed. And once we can do that, there will be some changes. There will always be some changes. Always.
If I can give an example, I almost sent this around, but I didn't have the permission to use the copyright. It would say NPR did a story about it, but I thought it would be interesting to the people in the council here. It was a councilwoman from Baltimore who was carjacked. She was 80, I think, or 79 when she was carjacked. She was assaulted, carjacked. So it's grand theft auto, it's an assault, it's all the things you can imagine. She was hospitalized. But her attitude about the carjacking was, well, look she was just about ready to finish her last term as councilwoman. She said, I've been a Baltimore City councilwoman for years. What kind of situation is it that young teenagers, it was young teenagers who carjacked her, are in such a situation that they would resort to this kind of violence, this kind of thing? She said, what's the issue? And eventually, through restorative justice, she became mentor to the two kids. One of the things she discovered is neither of the kids could read, even though they'd been through the school system. And so that was a big part of, they had to be, they were part of it, was they were assigned mandatory school programs to catch up to their school level. That was part of their, if you will, their sentence, rather than dealing with it. Instead of having these teenagers treated like adults and end up in prison and their life, therefore, probably, going in a direction that isn't healthy for them or for the community, you have a situation where they're being restored, they're being dealt with. Now, there's a lot of punishment. They had to do a lot of things for the community involved with it too. But the idea was, how do we restore? And she said, as a councilwoman, I'm somewhat responsible that these individuals didn't have the resources that they needed at the time, that they should have had them at a younger age. So, I mean, that's the kind of attitude, that's the kind of approach that treats it differently than just, throw them in jail, lock it up and throw the key away.
That's a good point, Monsignor. That's a very good point. And what we're dealing with is we're dealing with not only restorative justice, but transformative justice, which takes it a step further than restorative justice, when you could go back and you could deal with some of these issues, like the councilwoman in Baltimore. These kids had not been properly educated. And so this is more of a transformative justice issue than a restorative justice. That's what Howard Zehr talked about. He talked about transformative justice is a step beyond restorative justice. And not only that, but when I talked earlier about psychodrama, that is another step that could be included in a restorative justice circling conference.
Yeah, that's emphasized a great deal in the UK. UK has done this in many of the cities, the city councils, that it helps the victim deal with post-traumatic stress if they're involved in these processes, because then they can also help heal from the crime in a way, because they start to understand, why did this happen to me? How, and so they found it's been helpful for the victim as well, through, them being involved in the process, if they choose. Not every victim chooses or wants to be involved in these kinds of processes.
And not only that, Father, but some of the victims who are involved, I read about one story where the woman, the victim, went to the prison and talked to the person who killed her son. They had a restorative justice conference at the prison because she needed to have answers. Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my child? And the only way that she could get answers was through restorative justice. She could not get them through the retributive justice system, the criminal justice system. They used her to get this conviction. They used her, and they used the family members, and they used other witnesses to get the conviction of this kid. But after the kid was convicted and sent to prison, she started a dialogue with him. And she found out why her son was killed. And that's the only way that it could have happened that way. That's the only way.
One thing I have to say that I'll use an example from, I can't remember the title of the book now. The other Wes Moore, the book from Wes Moore. There was two young men the same age named Wes Moore from Baltimore. One went on to be a Army officer, West Pointer, Rhodes Scholar. The other went to prison. And the one that was Rhodes Scholar wrote a book about the other Wes Moore and saying how that could have been me. But one of the things that happened to him when he was a preteen, he was like 11 or 12 years old, when he was caught, the one that went to be a Rhodes Scholar, he was caught tagging, graffitiing. And the police officers cuffed them, put them in the back, he and a friend in the back of the police car. They could have taken them in and they would have been on the way to having a record. But the police officers gave them the break and made the decision that they hadn't seen these kids before getting in trouble. And they said, this is our first time seeing you, so we're not going to take you in, but we don't want to see you again. That was a moment that helped change this young man's life. And now he's, he was in the Obama administration. He was, served with valor and defending our country. So, I think the police officers do that work sometimes informally by making those decisions about who and how they interact with people on the street. But to have more formal processes that emphasize that kind of communal restoration, I think, is what we're suggesting. At least it's what I'm suggesting.
That's what I'm suggesting too, Monsignor. That's a very good point. And one of the things that we need to talk about is we need to talk about training like that for police officers. Police officers are part of our community, okay? They are people that we deal with on a regular basis. Like Mr. Barbie said, some are family members, they're police officers. So these are human beings as well. So we can deal with our situations through restorative justice.
Excuse me, this is Reverend Carter. I'm sorry. I'm trying to be open-minded. I'm trying to really, I believe in restorative justice. I think that's something we absolutely need. I just think that's a conversation for another time. Because restorative justice is after it happened. What we're trying to come up with is for solutions that stop the police brutality from happening, that stops the systematic racism before it happens. I know, and I agree, we've got to do something to fix those situations that have already occurred. And I'm the first somebody to be open-minded enough to say, yes, let's look at another way to deal with the victim. Let's look at another way to make people culpable for what they do. But this task force role is to come up with solutions that prevent this from happening now. Mayor, you gave us the thing about the 8 can't wait. I found that to more so than what we're doing. And again, I appreciate what Brother Stapleton has brought to the table, what the Village Initiative has brought to the table, and certainly I have utmost respect for Monsignor Swetland. But what we're to be dealing with is how do we deal with this systematic problem, these disparities that are part of our community that puts our children and grandchildren in harm's way simply because they are Black and brown or economically deprived or whatever the other issues are. That's what we need to be trying to wrap our minds around. And maybe restorative justice at some point is a part of that discussion. But I think right now, when I hear Brother Stapleton say that the police officer who was a part of, been charged with George Floyd's murder might get off because of a technicality. That's the problem, because that's what has always happened. They figure out some kind of way, this implied immunity figures out a way for that person to walk away as if he's done nothing. And we've got to fix that. That's what we're here for. That's what we've got to do. And I don't know, I'm not saying I have all the answers. I just don't hear it in restorative justice being the way to fix. Yes, it's a way to help. Yes, as we have people who come back into, reintegrate into the system, we've got to do a better job of all of that. But what we're trying to do, what I see our task is helping us to address the preventative part of this so that it doesn't continue to happen. There are some things we need to do and some things we need to talk about. And we can talk about that later, but I just don't see this. And I apologize for being emotional about this, but I just don't see this as being fruitful right now.
See, there's another component, Reverend Carter. There's another component to restorative justice. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there's a reactive part, the George Floyd aftermath. Then there's a proactive part. How do you prevent, how do you stop and think about how you're going to avoid a George Floyd situation? How are you going to avoid a situation where the police officers are profiling young Black kids? How are you going to avoid the Hispanics who are walking down the street, who are being harassed by the police officers? That is an issue that can also be taken up and discussed in restorative justice. It does not, I mean, there are situations, there are programs, for example, in California, where they are doing exactly that very same thing. There is a situation, or there's a woman in California who talks about, imagine how life would be without prisons. Imagine what life would be like without prisons. And she has a program that is discussing this very same issue with kids who are headed down the wrong path, who seem to be headed down the wrong path. You address it, you nip it in the bud right now before they are headed down the wrong path.
I would jump in real quick here. I think we got some other hands. I will say we'll probably need to bring this pretty much to a close. I would say to Reverend Carter, I think the issue of recidivism is also encompassed within this dialogue as it relates to persons that get out of prison, but then wind up going back into the system. And so I think, again, what Mr. Stapleton is saying is very key relative to the issue of recidivism and other community-related issues on this matter. I see Mr. Smart, and then I think I'd like to get a response from the sheriff and Chief York before we dismiss this afternoon as well. But go ahead, Curtis.
I was going to say, just from listening to all of the presenters tonight, that kind of what I've taken from everyone's presentation and how it ties together. And to Pastor Carter's point, restorative justice is important, and I believe that it starts kind of like what I feel like what you're saying is you don't see where restorative justice is the afterthought after we've done what we needed to do. But I think what they're saying is, for instance, he said earlier, the presenter said, having police, have policing in your community, from your community. That's the sense of restorative justice, because it creates an environment where someone may do something wrong that's a low level offense, but it may not get drawn out or blown up to something much greater. It may get handled right away and nipped in the bud at an earlier sense. And that's the restorative justice point that keeps them from having to take these drastic measures at a later date, which is equaling to the loss of lives in the African-American community and other communities as well. So I think restorative justice, depending on the angle that you approach it, it can come first. It doesn't necessarily have to come second or last. That was just going to be my statement on my rebuttal.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Go ahead, Sheriff and Chief, do you mind just having just a brief statement one way or the other to some of the things we've discussed?
I'll let Chief go first.
Yeah, sure. Commissioner, I've been listening to obviously the entire presentation. The village, it somewhat intrigues me. I've heard of it. I don't know where they're located. But the amount of distrust that citizens have when they get out of prison when it comes to the police, I understand that piece. But I'd like to be able to somehow connect. We have a community policing unit that has 20 officers that engages the community, and the village would be part of the community. I don't know, again, where they're located, but I'd love to be able to somehow connect my officers to the village, if that would work. But when it comes to restorative justice, you know, we have programs for our youth that we implement, and it's the OK program, which deals with youth that are struggling in school. We have the Penal program as well that deal with youth that are struggling in the neighborhoods, and we have obviously positive interaction with them when it comes to police officers. So could we do a better job? Yeah, I'm sure there's better ways to do it, but I really think we have a lot of programs in place at the local school districts that our officers engage the kids before they go down the wrong path.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And that, I think this opens up that opportunity for continuing to expand on some of the things that may already be there, to just expound upon them. Sheriff, anything?
Well, I agree with most everything that's been, said and talked about and discussed here today. We just moved the juveniles into the new juvenile detention facility over here, but that whole facility was designed under the paradigm of reducing additional trauma to our young people that are coming in contact with the criminal justice system, and restorative justice principles and practices that our judges and our community corrections people and our law enforcement could then, engage in with these young people and their families. I thank everybody for their presentations. I think they were well done and they were well put together. I'm working with the Village Initiative. I've been working with the Village Initiative for some time now, and we make their programs available to our folks that are in custody here that are going to be being released back into the community so that they can, to try to get some assistance. I agree with what Gordon said, that I think we could work with, we could start a dialogue at least with the Department of Corrections to, everybody has to do discharge planning before they come out. So I don't know why that couldn't include the state of Kansas giving them a Kansas ID card at least. And there may be some other requirements in terms of getting somebody's driver's license reinstated. There may be restitution that's owed or one thing is another, but maybe we can sort of work through those kinds of things in one way or another. I think that'd be a great benefit. But I think the key is really in relationships. I think we've got to get back to establishing those relationships with our children, like we did through the DARE program and so forth, when they were in preschool, when they were in kindergarten, when they were in first grade and second grade, and they started developing relationships with law enforcement officers of all genders, of all races, of all ethnicities, and so on and so forth, certainly number one. And number two, I think we have to do more in terms of and I want to speak to the issue of hiring. I've not been fully staffed in the 12 years or whatever that I've been here as the sheriff. Never been completely fully staffed. I guarantee you I've hired every qualified applicant at the end of the pre-employment process, regardless of their race or their gender or their age for that matter. I've hired people that were 52 years old, as well as some that were just 21 years old. Now we're hiring them under 21 years old and correctional specialists. So I've hired everyone that's been a qualified candidate because I've never gotten fully staffed. So, but in our training, I think we could do more to speak to what Pastor Carter's talking about. We can't do a one-day training on fair and impartial policing, or a 2-day training, or a 3-day training. We've got to do, more with regard to unconscious bias, making people aware of that, to talking about diversity, inclusion, having the hard conversations about racism. We need to bring people in from the community, from different races and ethnicities, into the training academy to talk about the experiences that they've had. We need to bring former offenders in, those that return back into our community that Village Initiative and others are working with. We need to bring them in and let them tell their story. We've got to make it relational. We've got to make it on a personal level so that we connect as human beings. And those individuals come in and connect with these young trainees who have all these idealistic ideas about what they're going to be and do when they're a police officer. And then they get out there on the shift actually and find out it's not a whole lot like that. And so I think we'd do better in our training and then our ongoing training to keep these conversations, these dialogues going. And we can talk about different ways that we can do that as we move forward.
Yeah, I think this has been a very productive conversation. It's been challenging, and someone had texted me. I said, we've got to be in it for the long haul. You just don't change these things overnight. So again, Monsignor Swetland, I want to thank you to Mr. Elder George and Mr. Barbie. I want to thank you all as well. Mr. Stapleton, thank you so much for being a part of this ongoing dialogue. I'm going to go out on Amazon tonight and order this little book of restorative justice just to have in my collection. And hopefully we can continue, as the mayor has initiated this conversation, as we continue it was just refreshing to hear that we need to continue to have restorative justice dialogue or restorative dialogue overall in our community as we move forward in dealing with these issues that plague us from a race and relations standpoint, so that we can ultimately move from restorative justice to what I heard called transformative justice. And so I think that's what will lead us to what one would call that beloved community that we all seek to have in Wyandotte County and Kansas City, Kansas. So again, I want to thank everybody, the task force, for your input, and all those that are watching online and otherwise. We appreciate you for being a part of this. And with that, we will bid everyone farewell until we meet again at the next time. Thank you all so much for this dialogue.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Task Force. Thank you, Mayor.
Have a great day.
Thank you.